And here is what I'm going to focus on. First of all, I will present some models that describe the turbulence of change and help you gain some insight into how you relate yourself to turbulence of change and those you are leading through change. Second and third, an overlooked contributor to the chaos of change, you may guess what that is before I get to it, and an important warning for you when you are the one facing change. Then I will talk about some universal truths about the experience of change, all of which will lead to guidelines for communicating during times of change. Now, before I go any further, interesting bullet items. They have a 10 in there. I didn't put that in there. That's so interesting. There's always some change when I give a presentation on change. But I do want to let you know that I've created a special page for you on my website with a bunch of goodies on it. The link for those of you who are only listening to the audio is www.nkarten.com. That's nkarten.com/change webinar. Change with a capital C, webinar with a capital W. I'll mention it again at the very end. Now, to start with, I'd like to introduce you to Eric. Eric is a software engineer who attended one of my seminars, and we were talking about this very issue of change and the turbulence and change and discussing experiences people had had with change. And so he told me about this experience that he had. He said he was part of a development team working on a major project with tight deadlines, and the company he was in had grown a lot, and the space was really pretty tight. And then one Thursday, with no warning at all, Eric's manager announced to the team, "Tomorrow you will pack up all your things. Over the weekend we will be moving to Building C, where we will have much more room." Well, Eric was shocked, as were many of his teammates. Sure, he had complained about the crowded conditions, but he didn't want to move away. He didn't want to be away from his friends and out of the action and out of the loop. He didn't want to move, and he certainly didn't want to move so abruptly. And I think Eric typifies the experience of change for so many people. He didn't like some of the conditions where he was, but he didn't want them to change either. Or could it be that the way the change was introduced had something to do with his reaction? Let's keep Eric in mind as we proceed, and you might begin to think also about experiences you have had personally with change and with leading others through change. I want to talk about 3 models of change, 2 very briefly and 1 at much greater length. And the first one is the William Bridges change model, which he describes in length in the book Managing Transitions, a very, very fine book. And the model that he presents is as simple as can be, begins with ending, then the neutral zone, and then beginning. And normally we might think of things starting with the beginning, but he makes the point that when we're talking about change, change begins with ending. It begins with giving something up. And then you go into, or the people affected by change go into what he calls the neutral zone, which is that messy time when you're no longer where things are familiar and safe, but not yet at that new place where things will become familiar. And at length you end up at a new beginning, which itself has some adjustment. Bridges is very astute in talking about loss, and I think that's one of the key contributions he makes. And one of the things he said, and I'll quote him from his book, he says, "You need to bring losses out into the open. It's not talking about a loss, but rather pretending that it doesn't exist that stirs up the trouble." The second model I want to mention is Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, and you may very well be already familiar, if not with her name, then with her stages of acceptance. In her case, as a medical doctor, stages of acceptance among patients who were dealing with terminal conditions. She observed that people go through certain stages. And from my perspective, in dealing with the subject of change, you might not have thought about her model as one that has to do with change, but it certainly does. And one of the key things that it contributes is the notion that although there are 5 stages in her model, people don't all go through all 5 stages. They don't spend the same length of time in these stages. They may skip over some stages. They may circle around back, going from denial to anger to bargaining back to denial and so on. And so people have their own ways of traveling through these stages, and they are as relevant in any change that people experience, even if it's not, and hopefully it is not, in the case of a terminal condition of a person in a hospital. She also very effectively talks about the impact of communication and how important it is in helping people deal with the turbulence of the change that they are experiencing. The third model I want to talk about is one that I will spend quite a bit more time on, the change model of Virginia Satir. Now, if you are not familiar with Virginia Satir, you are not alone. She is not very well known in organizational settings. She was actually a family therapist and a pioneer in the field of family therapy, and she came up with numerous concepts and models and techniques that help families deal with their issues. But what we have found in the last couple of decades is that many of her models have direct applicability into the organizational setting, and so I have been one of a number of people who've been introducing these models into organizations, and her change model is the one that I really like to present the most because it is so accessible once you hear it and once you take a look at it. This is what the model looks like. And the first thing I need to say about it is that there are many depictions of this model. In the event that you should read up on it in other places, you will find different depictions of it. I've seen probably a dozen different ways that different people who talk about it like to present it. This is my own particular depiction, and I like it simply because it's colorful. Whoever you might read, however, who talks about it does focus on these same elements. And as you can see, this is a model that deals with changes over time in performance or in productivity, or in your ability to just do whatever you need to do as a result of change. So what we can do is to break it down and talk about it in a little more detail. And as I do this, think about the changes that you have experienced or observed in your own organization. The model begins with old status quo. And old status quo is however things are before a particular change comes along. And how things are may be very steady and stable or very turbulent, but they are however they are before a particular change comes along. Well, into every status quo comes a foreign element. And the foreign element is the change. It feels like a pow. And a foreign element is anything that upsets the relative balance of the old status quo and throws the system into chaos. Now, notice I'm using this word system here not in the IT sense of system, but rather referring to the individual or team or department or organization or family or whatever individual or group of people are experiencing change. A comment about this word foreign element, or the phrase foreign element. This is the one Virginia Satir uses in her representation of this model. And in the last few years, I've come to think that maybe it's no longer the best phrase, the best terminology to use, because it could convey the idea that it refers to someone from outside this company or this culture who is not welcome, and that is not the intention at all. In fact, I had the experience of presenting this model to a particular group, and the person came up to me afterwards and she said, "You really shouldn't call it a foreign element. I am a foreigner, and I don't like that term." And I acknowledge that point of view, and in fact, in my book, Changing How You Manage and Communicate Change, I offer some thoughts about possible alternatives to this particular